The brain processes emotional suppression and emotional regulation through fundamentally different neural mechanisms. When you suppress an emotion versus when you regulate it, distinct networks activate, different stress hormones circulate, and separate long term consequences unfold. Understanding this distinction matters because one approach supports psychological well being, while the other may undermine it in ways that accumulate over years. There's a widespread misconception that emotional maturity means emotional invisibility. We admire the composed person at the meeting who never raises their voice, the parent who stays perfectly calm during a tantrum, the friend who always seems unflappable. This leads many of us to equate emotional suppression, the active pushing down of feelings, with sophisticated emotional management. This confusion appears even in professional contexts. In high stress fields like medicine, law enforcement, and the military, suppression is often explicitly taught as an emotional strategy. Compartmentalize. Don't let them see it affect you. The underlying assumption is that controlling the outward expression of emotion means you've mastered the emotion itself. What makes this misconception persistent is that suppression does work in the short term. When you clamp down on anger during a confrontation, you avoid saying something you might regret. When you maintain composure despite feeling devastated, you get through the social interaction. The immediate behavioral outcome, appearing composed, makibot, reinforces the strategy. The problem is that your brain and body are having entirely different experiences during suppression versus regulation. What appears as control on the surface may involve competing neural processes underneath. The consequences of this difference don't show up immediately. They accumulate over time in ways that research is only beginning to map. To understand what's happening, let's follow an emotion from trigger to response. Imagine you're in a meeting where someone takes credit for your work. The emotional response begins in interconnected brain regions. Your amygdala works with your anterior cingulate cortex and insula to process the significance of what's happened. Joseph Ledoux's research on fear processing shows that this emotional activation occurs rapidly, often before conscious awareness kicks in. This network tags the situation as important and begins cascading stress hormones through your system. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your attention narrows. This emotional activation is already underway before you've consciously decided how to respond. Here's where the critical difference emerges. During suppression, your prefrontal cortex essentially puts a lid on emotional expression without addressing the underlying activation. James Gross, in his foundational 2002 paper, Emotion Regulation, Affective, Cognitive, and Social Consequences, published in Psychosomatic Medicine, describes suppression as response-focused. You're managing the output while leaving the input unchanged. This creates what Daniel Wegner termed ironic processing effects in his classic research on thought suppression. The effort to not think about or feel something requires your brain to continuously monitor for that very thing. Neuroimaging studies show that suppression actually increases activation in the brain regions, processing the unwanted emotion, like trying to ignore a fire alarm while the alarm keeps ringing. Meanwhile, your sympathetic nervous system remains activated. Blood pressure stays elevated, stress hormones like cortisol continue circulating, and your immune system interprets these signals as evidence of ongoing threat. All of this occurs while you appear perfectly calm. Emotional regulation works through a different mechanism entirely. Instead of muting the alarm, regulation involves earlier intervention in the emotional process, before the feeling has fully developed. Gross calls this antecedent-focused regulation, intervening at the source rather than managing downstream effects. The most studied regulation strategy is cognitive reappraisal. When you reappraise, you update your brain's interpretation of what's happening. Instead of, "This person stole my idea and humiliated me," you might reframe it as, "This is frustrating, but it's an opportunity to clarify my contributions and establish better communication." Neuroimaging reveals a distinct pattern during successful reappraisal. Your prefrontal cortex becomes more active in regions involved in cognitive control, but unlike suppression, this increased prefrontal activity actually reduces activation in the amygdala and other emotion processing areas. You're not covering up the emotional response, you're modulating the intensity at its source. The physiological effects differ as well. While suppression maintains stress hormone levels, regulation strategies like reappraisal are associated with decreases in cortisol, blood pressure, and inflammatory markers. Your parasympathetic nervous system can engage, allowing your body to return toward baseline. The key insight is that regulation isn't about eliminating emotions or necessarily changing how you feel in the moment. It's about creating space between stimulus and response, allowing you to choose your reaction based on your values and goals rather than immediate emotional impulse. The anger about your stolen idea might remain, but it becomes information rather than a command. The research reveals complications when we examine long term patterns. Studies of chronic suppression show effects that extend beyond temporary stress. Butler and colleagues found in a 2003 emotion study that habitual suppressors tend to have smaller social networks and less intimate relationships, even when controlling for personality factors like introversion. The researchers suggest that suppression creates a kind of emotional inauthenticity that others can detect, even unconsciously. Memory research adds another layer. Richards and Gross demonstrated in a 2000 Journal of Personality and Social Psychology study that people who regularly suppress emotions may show impaired recall for emotional events. The act of suppression appears to interfere with how memories are encoded and stored, creating gaps in autobiographical memory. But the effectiveness of both suppression and regulation varies dramatically across cultural contexts. Soto and colleagues showed in a 2011 psychological science study that suppression strategies adaptive in collectivist societies focused on group harmony might be maladaptive in individualist cultures that prioritize personal expression. People from cultures where emotional restraint is valued may experience fewer negative health effects from suppression. The replication picture is mixed. While the basic distinction between suppression and regulation has been replicated across many labs, some dramatic claims about suppression's effects have proven harder to reproduce. Aldau and colleagues' 2010 meta-analysis in clinical psychology review found that the relationship between suppression and psychological problems, while real, is smaller and more variable than early studies suggested. Clinical populations complicate these categories further. People with certain autism spectrum conditions may use what appears to be suppression, but is actually sensory regulation, managing overwhelming emotional input rather than hiding socially unacceptable feelings. Individuals with complex trauma histories may have learned suppression as a survival strategy, and pushing toward more expressive regulation without adequate safety can be counterproductive. Some recent research suggests that brief, strategic suppression might actually enhance longer-term regulation. Cross and colleagues have shown that temporarily suppressing an emotion while gaining psychological distance, imagining how you'll feel about the situation in a year, can make subsequent reappraisal more effective. The research suggests 3 shifts in how you might approach your emotional life. First, distinguish between what you feel and what you do with what you feel. Emotions provide information about your needs and values. When you notice anger, sadness, or anxiety, pause long enough to ask what this feeling might be telling you. This isn't about indulging every emotional impulse, but about treating emotions as data rather than noise to eliminate. Second, recognize that regulation is a skill requiring practice, especially if you've defaulted to suppression for years. The neural pathways supporting reappraisal and other regulation strategies strengthen with use. Start with mild frustrations rather than major crises. Practice reframing situations before you're emotionally activated. Your long commute becomes time for podcasts or reflection. A boring meeting becomes a chance to practice patience and observe group dynamics. Third, consider the social dimension of your emotional patterns. If you've been chronically suppressing, people around you may have adapted to your emotional unavailability. Moving toward more authentic emotional expression might initially create relationship friction. That's not necessarily a sign you're doing something wrong. It may indicate you're changing a system others have learned to navigate. The goal isn't to become emotionally unfiltered. Regulation still involves choice and intentionality, but choice based on understanding rather than reflex, authenticity rather than just social acceptability. When you're genuinely regulating rather than suppressing, you can be both emotionally honest and socially skillful. Be patient with yourself as you develop these skills. If you've spent years treating emotions as problems to solve rather than experiences to understand, shifting toward regulation will feel unfamiliar. Your brain needs time to build new neural pathways while weakening old ones. The difference between emotional suppression and emotional regulation isn't just academic. It's the difference between managing your feelings and being managed by them. Suppression treats emotions like interruptions to minimize. Regulation treats them like an internal guidance system to understand and navigate skillfully. When you suppress, you create distance between your conscious mind and your emotional experience. When you regulate, you develop fluency in your own internal signals. The emotions don't disappear, but your relationship with them shifts from adversarial to collaborative. That transformation changes not just how you feel, but how you think, relate to others, and move through the world.